Happy Friday, everybody. It is day 10 of the 40-day Homestead Challenge, where we're trying to cultivate real life. If you haven't been watching with us, we've been doing a lot of different things trying to get things ready for our garden. So you can always go back, and I'll link up here above so that you can go and start from the beginning if you just want to catch up on the series. But if you have been watching, you know that our garden has been coming along nicely. And you also know that we're a little concerned about the size of the garden. Maybe we're not going to have enough space. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about that and some of the things that we're exploring for what we can do going forward. But it's Friday out here on our homestead, and work continues. It always does. I think that's true for anybody that is living on a homestead. But we've got some things that we want to share with you yesterday. One thing special on the heels of yesterday's post where we talked about some of our biggest lessons learned. I want to share, this is a personal one that impacted our entire family and a lot of the chickens, but it also shows just how little we actually knew when we got started, but some of the things that we're learning. So stay tuned for that in just a few minutes. So we're really excited and pleased about how well the garden is coming along. We've got a lot of plants in place. It's seemingly starting to take off. Really haven't seen any plants that haven't adapted well. But there are two things about the garden that I don't really want to say we're concerned about, but we just have our eye on. The first is invasion from wildlife. So I was actually talking with a friend the other night at church, and he said, "Are you planting corn?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, better get ready. You're going to have deer. Deer will come after the corn." And I think deer just come after anything and everything. But I am concerned about that. We have seen deer on the farm out behind us and along the tree line. So we know that they're around. So we put in our very simple poultry net fencing, and that was mainly to keep the chickens out of the garden area. And thus far, it seemingly worked very well. But we have an idea. We want to try to begin making this a more permanent gardening space. And that's a good idea because it sets this aside for gardening, but we're also a little apprehensive about making it permanent. So here's what I did. In order to transition us away from this poultry net fencing, we have purchased some temporary netting that we can put up. It's black netting, it's kind of thin, so it's not as much of a visual barrier, but it's also 5 feet high, which is taller than this. And in order to connect it, I had to get what's called a T-bar post. And these posts can go in the ground at the different corners along the way, and you can attach the netting to it. Now, I'm not going to attach the netting today because I'm not ready to make that final decision, but I do want to go ahead and put in the post where we think the outline of the garden will be. Now that's not fully in the ground just yet, and I don't want it to be. I actually just want it to stay kind of about where it is because we want to get some visual sighting about where all of this is going to be. So it kind of brings me to the second point, which is how big do we want this garden to be? And one of the things that we noticed is we kind of stopped our garden edge way up from the circular part of the driveway. So we probably could come down probably another 7 feet and capture even more space. Now I want to be careful because this is sloped land, and that means that you introduce shadows, you introduce runoff, all kinds of things. But I think we can capture that space and do something with it. So we're putting up temporary fencing this year, and maybe by the time we get to the fall, certainly over the winter, we might look to put in more permanent fencing. And with permanent fencing, we're looking at hopefully a much better way of being able to keep wildlife out and also keep our chickens out. So I'm coming through this area and I saw something laying on the ground. I want to pick it up and show you. This is an oyster shell. We do not live at the beach. As a matter of fact, we're at least 2 hours from the ocean. So you're probably wondering, hey John, what's up with the oyster shells? And do you just have one or do you have many? Well, believe it or not, there's a funny story here behind this, and I want to share it with you because it kind of goes in with yesterday's theme about lessons learned, and this one is about me. So when we first got chickens, and I'll tell you guys, I was not really all that excited about getting chickens. I thought chickens are going to be smelly, they're going to be nasty, they're going to be loud. You know, that's a lot of headache to go through just to get some eggs when you can just go to the store and get some eggs. So I just really wasn't behind it. But Melinda was, and she persisted, and I said, well, hey, I mean, if this is something that makes you happy, then sure, why not? Let's have chickens. So we got a few to start with, and we got them from a friend, and we were very, very fortunate to get those. But we heard somewhere along the way that chickens like oyster shells because the grit from the oyster shell can help them with digestion. So, as luck would have it, I was working for a company at the time, and in the office space below where my office was in this building, there's a different company. And I think this was maybe in like November sometime. They were having an oyster roast. So they were having a big cookout for their office, and they had a grill out there, and there was a guy out there, and I could smell the grill because it was right down below my window, and he was out there grilling these oysters, and then they would just take them right off, and people could eat the oyster shells. And you know, I'm not a huge fan of that. Maybe you are, but it's just not my personal preference. But it's okay if you want to do it. But I saw this and I said, wait a minute, hold on, I get it. Melinda said we need oyster shells, and why in the world should we go and buy oyster shells at the store when we could just get some for free? So I hustled on up, went downstairs, walked over to the guy on the grill, introduced myself, said, how you doing? What you guys doing? And we had a nice little chat, and I said, well, you're never going to believe this, but my wife and I have chickens, and apparently it's a good idea to give them oyster shells. And he looked at me like I was crazy, mainly because he said, I don't know anything about chickens, but if you say so, that's fine. I said, well, what are you going to do with the oyster shells? And he said, we're probably just going to throw them away. I said, don't do it. Put them in a box or something. I'm going to go and get my car. I'll drive over. I'll pick them up. Let me take them home. So I did just that. And I came home with 2 flats of oyster shells that these guys had, they were used from their cookout, but I brought them home and I was beaming with pride. I thought Melinda is going to love this, and more importantly, she's going to love me because I brought home oyster shells and we didn't have to buy them. So I took her out to the car and I said, you've got to see this. And we opened it up and I had 2 boxes full of these things. She began to laugh. And not well, I mean, she was kind of laughing at me. That's because of the way this story is going to turn out. But she began to laugh and she said, you understand that we need crushed up oyster shells, like grit from oyster shells, right? And I was so frustrated. I mean, I just had probably the blankest look on my face. And I just brought these boxes of oyster shells out here to where our coop was at the time, and I just dumped them on the ground. And I was kind of frustrated, thinking, here I am, I made a fool of myself getting these oyster shells and thinking I'm doing this awesome thing, and then I find out I'm really getting the wrong thing. Guys, that's one of my big mistakes, and it's also one of my biggest lessons learned. I now know that we need crushed up oyster shells for grit, and we actually give them to them, and we do buy it. But every time I see one of these things on the ground, I'm reminded of that story. And I tell you that to say that it keeps me a bit humble, but also just to say, hey, if you're thinking about just starting a patio garden right now, and you don't know dirt from the pot, or you don't know one seed from another, right? Don't be intimidated by that. You're going to make mistakes. I made a mistake, and yet we learn from it, and we get to apply that. And now our chickens are happy and healthy, and we get lots of oyster shells all over our ground. Well, that about does it for today. I've got a few cleanup items that I'm going to do outside. We've had a great day out here, and I'm glad that you joined us. Thanks for sticking with us here on day 10 of the 40-day Cultivating Real Life Homestead Challenge. I'm going to take this trusty knife right now. I've got a few weeds that are growing up in some areas. I'm going to cut them and give them to the chickens. That's another lesson learned. Chickens love to eat the weeds on the ground. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow for day 11. Have a great evening.